Section 4 of Tanglewood Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Tanglewood Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Pygmies, Part 1. A great while ago, when the world was full of wonders, there lived an earthborn giant named Antaeus, and a million or more of curious little earthborn people, who were called Pygmies. This giant and these Pygmies, being children of the same mother, that is to say, our good old Grandmother Earth, were all brethren, and dwelt together in a very friendly and affectionate manner, far, far off in the middle of hot Africa. The Pygmies were so small, and there were so many sandy deserts and such high mountains between them and the rest of mankind, that nobody could get a peep at them oftener than once in 100 years. As for the giant, being of a very lofty stature, it was easy enough to see him, but safest to keep out of his sight. Among the Pygmies, I suppose, if one of them grew to the height of 6 feet or 8 inches, he was reckoned to be a prodigiously tall man. It must have been very pretty to behold their little cities, with streets 2 or 3 feet wide, paved with the smallest pebbles, and bordered by habitations about as big as a squirrel's cage. The king's palace attained to the stupendous magnitude of Periwinkle's baby house, and stood in the centre of a spacious square, which could hardly have been covered by our hearth rug. The principal temple or cathedral was as lofty as yonder bureau, and was looked upon as a wonderfully sublime and magnificent edifice. All these structures were built neither of stone nor wood. They were neatly plastered together by the Pygmy workmen, pretty much like birds' nests, out of straw, feathers, eggshells, and other small bits of stuff, with stiff clay instead of mortar. And when the hot sun had dried them, they were just as snug and comfortable as a Pygmy could desire. The country round about was conveniently laid out in fields, the largest of which was nearly of the same extent as one of Sweet Fern's flower beds. Here the Pygmies used to plant wheat and other kinds of grain, which, when it grew up and ripened, overshadowed these tiny people as the pines and the oaks and the walnut and chestnut trees overshadow you and me, when we walk in our own tracts of woodland. At harvest time they were forced to go with their little axes and cut down the grain, exactly as a woodcutter makes a clearing in the forest. And when a stalk of wheat, with its overburdened top, chanced to come down crashing upon an unfortunate Pygmy, it was apt to be a sad affair. If it did not smash him to pieces at least, I am sure it must have made the poor fellow's head ache. Oh my stars! If the fathers and mothers were so small, what must the children and babies have been? A whole family of them might have been put to bed in a shoe, or have crept into an old glove and played at hide and seek in its thumb and fingers. You might have hidden a year-old baby under a thimble. Now these funny Pygmies, as I told you before, had a giant for a neighbor and a brother, who was bigger, if possible, than they were little. He was so very tall that he carried a pine tree, which was 8 feet through the butt, for a walking stick. It took a far-sighted Pygmy, I can assure you, to discern his summit without the help of a telescope, and sometimes in misty weather they could not see his upper half, but only his long legs, which seemed to be striding about by themselves. But at noonday, in a clear atmosphere, when the sun shone brightly over him, the giant Antaeus presented a very grand spectacle. There he used to stand, a perfect mountain of a man, with his great countenance smiling down upon his little brothers, and his one vast eye, which was as big as a cartwheel, and placed right in the centre of his forehead, giving a friendly wink to the whole nation at once. The Pygmies loved to talk with Antaeus, and 50 times a day one or another of them would turn up his head and shout through the hollow of his fists, "Hello, brother Antaeus! How are you, my good fellow?" And when the distant squeak of their voices reached his ear, the giant would make answer, "Pretty well, brother Pygmy, I thank you," in a thunderous roar that would have shaken down the walls of their strongest temple, only that it came from so far aloft. It was a very happy circumstance that Antaeus was the Pygmy people's friend, for there was more strength in his little finger than in 1,000,000 of such bodies as this. If he had been as ill-natured to them as he was to everybody else, he might have beaten down their biggest city in one kick, and hardly have known that he did it. With the tornado of his breath he could have stripped the roofs of 100 dwellings and sent thousands of inhabitants whirling through the air. He might have set his immense foot upon a multitude. When he took it up again, there would have been a pitiful sight, to be sure. But being the son of Mother Earth, as they likewise were, the giant gave them his brotherly kindness, and loved them with as big a love as it was possible to feel for creatures so very small; and, on their parts, the Pygmies loved Antaeus with as much affection as their tiny hearts could hold. He was always ready to do any good offices that lay in his power, as for example, when they wanted a breeze to turn their windmills, the giant would set all the sails a-going with the mere natural respiration of his lungs. When the sun was too hot, he often sat himself down and let his shadow fall over the kingdom, from one frontier to the other; and as for matters in general, he was wise enough to let them alone, and leave the Pygmies to manage their own affairs, which, after all, is about the best thing that great people can do for little ones. In short, as I said before, Antaeus loved the Pygmies, and the Pygmies loved Antaeus. The giant's life being as long as his body was large, while the lifetime of a Pygmy was but a span. This friendly intercourse had been going on for innumerable generations and ages. It was written about in the Pygmy histories and talked about in the ancient traditions. The most venerable and white-bearded Pygmy had never heard of a time, even in his greatest of grandfathers' days, when the giant was not their enormous friend. Once, to be sure, as was recorded on an obelisk 3 feet high, erected on the place of the catastrophe, Antaeus sat down upon about 5,000 Pygmies, who were assembled at the military review. But this was one of those unlucky accidents for which nobody is to blame, so that the small folks never took it to heart, and only requested the giant to be careful forever afterwards to examine the acre of ground where he intended to squat himself. It is a very pleasant picture to imagine Antaeus standing among the Pygmies, like the spire of the tallest cathedral that was ever built, while they ran about like pismires at his feet, and to think that in spite of their difference in size, there were affection and sympathy between them and him. Indeed, it has always seemed to me that the giant needed the little people more than the Pygmies needed the giant. For, unless they had been his neighbors and well-wishers, and, as we may say, his playfellows, Antaeus would not have had a single friend in the world. No other being like himself had ever been created. No creature of his own size had ever talked to him, in thunder-like accents, face to face. When he stood with his head among the clouds, he was quite alone, and had been so for hundreds of years, and would be so forever. Even if he had met another giant, Antaeus would have fancied the world not big enough for two such vast personages, and instead of being friends with him, he would have fought him till one of the two was killed. But with the Pygmies he was the most sportive and humorous, and merry-hearted and sweet-tempered old giant that ever washed his face in a wet cloud. His little friends, like all other small people, had a great opinion of their own importance, and used to assume quite a patronizing air towards the giant. Poor creature, they said to one another, he has a very dull time of it, all by himself, and we ought not to grudge wasting a little of our precious time to amuse him. He is not half so bright as we are, to be sure, and for that reason he needs us to look after his comfort and happiness. Let us be kind to the old fellow. Why, if Mother Earth had not been very kind to ourselves, we might all have been giants too. On all their holidays the Pygmies had excellent sport with Antaeus. He often stretched himself out at full length on the ground, where he looked like a long ridge of a hill, and it was a good hour's walk, no doubt, for a short-legged Pygmy to journey from head to foot of the giant. He would lay down his great hand flat on the grass, and challenge the tallest of them to clamber upon it, and straddle from finger to finger. So fearless were they that they made nothing of creeping in amongst the folds of his garments. When his head lay sidewise on the earth, they would march boldly up and peep into the great cavern of his mouth, and take it all as a joke, as indeed it was meant, when Antaeus gave a sudden snap of his jaws, as if he were going to swallow 50 of them at once. You would have laughed to see the children dodging in and out among his hair, or swinging from his beard. It is impossible to tell half of the funny tricks that they played with their huge comrade. But I do not know that anything was more curious than when a party of boys were seen running races on his forehead, to try which of them could get first around the circle of his one great eye. It was another favorite feat with them to march along the ridge of his nose, and to jump down upon his upper lip. If truth must be told, they were sometimes as troublesome to the giant as a swarm of ants or mosquitoes, especially as they had a fondness for mischief, and liked to prick his skin with their little swords and lances, to see how thick and tough it was. But Antaeus took it all kindly enough. Also, once in a while, when he happened to be very sleepy, he would grumble out a peevish word or two, like the muttering of a tempest, and ask them to have done with their nonsense. A great deal oftener, however, he watched their merriment and gambols until his huge, heavy, clumsy wits were completely stirred up by them, and then he would roar out such a tremendous volume of immeasurable laughter that the whole nation of Pygmies had to put their hands to their ears, else it would certainly have deafened them. "Ho, ho, ho!" quoth the Giant, shaking his mountainous sides. "What a funny thing it is to be little! If I were not Antaeus, I should like to be a Pygmy, just for the joke's sake." The Pygmies had but one thing to trouble them in the world. They were constantly at war with the cranes, and had always been so, ever since the long-lived Giant could remember. From time to time very terrible battles had been fought, in which sometimes the little men won the victory, and sometimes the cranes. According to some historians, the Pygmies used to go to battle mounted on the backs of goats and rams. But such animals as these must have been far too big for the Pygmies to ride upon, so that I rather suppose they rode on squirrel back, or rabbit back, or rat back, or perhaps upon hedgehogs, whose pricky quills would be very terrible to the enemy. However this might be, and whatever creatures the Pygmies rode upon, I do not doubt they made a very formidable appearance, armed with sword and spear and bow and arrow, blowing their little trumpet and shouting their little war cry. They never failed to exhort one another to fight bravely and recollect that the world had its eyes upon them, although, in simple truth, the only spectator was the giant Antaeus, with his one great stupid eye in the middle of his forehead. When the two armies joined battle, the cranes would rush forward, flapping their wings and stretching out their necks, and would perhaps snatch up some of the Pygmies crosswise in their beaks. Whenever this happened, it was truly an awful spectacle to see those little men of might kicking and sprawling in the air, and at last disappearing down the crane's long crooked throat, swallowed up alive. A hero, you know, must hold himself in readiness for any kind of fate, and doubtless the glory of the thing was a consolation to him, even in the crane's gizzard. If Antaeus observed that the battle was going hard against his little allies, he generally stopped laughing, and ran with mile-long strides to their assistance, flourishing his club aloft and shouting at the cranes, who quacked and croaked and retreated as fast as they could. Then the Pygmy army would march homeward in triumph, attributing the victory entirely to their own valor, and the warlike skill and strategy of whomsoever happened to be captain general. And for a tedious while afterwards nothing would be heard of but grand processions and public banquets and brilliant illuminations, and shows of waxwork and likenesses of the distinguished officers as small as life. In the above described warfare, if a Pygmy chanced to pluck out a crane's tail feather, it proved a very great feather in his cap. Once or twice, if you will believe me, a little man was made chief ruler of the nation for no other merit in the world than bringing home such a feather. But I have now said enough to let you see what a gallant little people these were, and how happily they and their forefathers, for nobody knows how many generations, had lived with the immeasurable giant Antaeus. In the remaining part of the story I shall tell you of a far more astonishing battle than any of that was fought between the Pygmies and the cranes. One day the mighty Antaeus was lolling at full length among his friends. His pine-tree walking-stick lay on the ground close by his side. His head was in one part of the kingdom, and his feet extended across the boundaries to another part, and he was taking whatever comfort he could get, while the Pygmies scrambled over him, and peeped into his cavernous mouth, and played among his hair. Sometimes for a minute or two the giant dropped asleep and snorted like a rush of a whirlwind. During one of these little bits of slumber a Pygmy chanced to climb upon his shoulder, and took a view around the horizon, as from the summit of a hill, and he beheld something a long way off, which made him rub the bright specks of his eyes and look sharper than before. At first he mistook it for a mountain, and wondered how it had grown up so suddenly out of the earth. But soon he saw the mountain move. As it came nearer and nearer, what should it turn out to be but a human shape, not as big as Antaeus, it is true, although a very enormous figure in comparison with Pygmies, and a vast deal bigger than the man we see nowadays. When the Pygmy was quite satisfied that his eyes had not deceived him, he scampered as fast as his legs would carry him to the giant's ear, and stooped over its cavity and shouted lustily into it. "Hello, brother Antaeus, get up this minute and take your pine-tree walking-stick in your hand. Here comes another giant to have a tussle with you." "Pooh, pooh," grumbled Antaeus, only half awake. "None of your nonsense, my little fellow. Don't you see I am sleepy? There is not a giant on earth for whom I would take the trouble to get up." But the Pygmy looked again, and now perceived that the stranger was coming directly towards the prostrate form of Antaeus. With every step he looked less like a blue mountain and more like an immensely large man. He was soon so nigh that there could be no possible mistake about the matter. There he was, with the sun flaming on his golden helmet and flashing from his polished breastplate. He had a sword by his side and a lion's skin over his back, and on his right shoulder he carried a club, which looked bulkier and heavier than the pine-tree walking-stick of Antaeus. By this time the whole nation of the Pygmies had seen the new wonder, and 1,000,000 of them set up a shout all together, so that it really made quite an audible squeak. "Get up, Antaeus! Bestir yourself, you lazy old giant! Here comes another giant, as strong as you are, to fight with you." "Nonsense, nonsense!" growled the sleepy giant. "I will have my nap out, come who may." Still the stranger drew nearer, and now the Pygmies could plainly discern that, if his stature were less lofty than the giant's, yet his shoulders were even broader, and in truth what a pair of shoulders they must have been! As I told you a long while ago, they once upheld the sky. The Pygmies, being 10 times as vivacious as the great numbskull of a brother, could not abide the giant's slow movements, and were determined to have him on his feet. So they kept shouting to him, and even went as far as to prick him with their swords. "Get up, get up, get up!" they cried. "Up with you, lazy bones! The strange giant's club is bigger than your own. His shoulders are the broadest, and we think him the stronger of the two." Antaeus could not endure to have it said that any mortal was half so mighty as himself. This latter remark of the Pygmies pricked him deeper than their swords, and sitting up, in rather a sulky humor, he gave a gape of several yards wide, rubbed his eyes, and finally turned his stupid head in the direction whither his little friends were so eagerly pointing. No sooner did he set his eyes on the stranger than, leaping to his feet, seizing his walking-stick, he strode a mile or two to meet him, all the while brandishing the sturdy pine-tree so that it whistled through the air. "Who are you?" thundered the giant, "and what do you want in my dominions?" There was one more strange thing about Antaeus, of which I have not yet told you, lest, hearing of so many wonders all in a lump, you might not believe much more than half of them. You are to know, then, that whenever this redoubtable giant touched the ground either with his hand, his foot, or any other part of his body, he grew stronger than he had ever been before. The earth, you remember, was his mother, and was very fond of him, as being almost the biggest of her children, and so she took this method of keeping him always in full vigor. Some persons affirm that he grew 10 times stronger at every touch. Others say that it was only twice as strong. But only think of it. Whenever Antaeus took a walk, supposing it were about 10 miles, and when he stepped 100 yards at a stride, you may try to cipher out how much mightier he was on sitting down again when he had first started, and whenever he flung himself on the earth to take a little repose, even if he got up the very next instant, he would be as strong as exactly 10 just such giants as his former self. It was well for the world that Antaeus happened to be of a sluggish disposition, and liked ease better than exercise, for, if he had frisked about like the Pygmies, and touched the earth as often as they did, he would long ago have been strong enough to pull down the sky about people's ears. But these great lubberly fellows resemble mountains, not only in bulk, but in their disinclination to move. End of Part 1 of Chapter 4. Recording by Ellie. July 2009.